Foden. Excuse me, Foden. You have a what is going on with you? Ma'am. Foden was the name for a 420 steam locomotive that, well, it almost isn't a steam locomotive at all. It's a rail tractor that was based off of a steam lorry. It was rebuilt to run on rails and given a chain drive. You know, like a bike. Which is something that isn't unheard of when it comes to rail technology, but it's not used that often. She ran on a narrow gauge tramway, the Beaudesert Shire tramway, that was in Queensland, Australia. She was definitely an amalgamation of a bunch of different pieces, and definitely a bizarre experiment, but she actually did alright, all things considered. They only needed her to shunt small things around, and a chain drive, I mean, it's not a great decision, but if all she's doing is the bare minimum in terms of shunting duties, you can get away with that. A sturdy enough chain will do you just fine. She was never very fast or very strong, but she did what they needed them to do, and for not that much cost investment. It's believed they already had the steam lorry anyway. They just rebuilt it. So, hey, more power to her, I suppose. It's not really known what happened to her, though, given she's no longer around, I think it can be assumed that she's been scrapped. The Statens Jonsvega SJA 1474 Turbine lock. Sweden, I just got done, just a few weeks ago, discussing how you actually made steam turbines work. What the heck is that? Why are the drivers behind that's not where those are... I should probably be thanking my Discord server for pretty much all of these. These were mostly suggestions from them, so thanks you guys. And for this one in particular, special thanks to the rough translation, since any source about this particular locomotive seems to be in Swedish, which I can barely read, let alone understand. According to limited information we have, the drivers were in that position because it consisted of a boiler wagon with a steam boiler, as well as the cab, plus a machine wagon with a steam turbine in it. It had a condenser in the tender, but apparently the tender contained that and water. The coal was actually kept in the front, next to the boiler, so it's a tank engine, even though it doesn't look like it. It basically can't function without the tender at all. It needs it. I mean, most tender engines do need their tenders, but this one really needed it. And I guess they put the drivers there because that's where they thought most of the weight would be? But, okay, there's just so many things that don't make sense about that. For one thing, as the water dissipates, you're gonna have less weight on those drivers. Logistically, the boiler in the front would always have a significant weight on it, unless the condenser in the tender was really that heavy. And it may have been, that's possible, but this is still just absurd, and there's a reason the design was never repeated. Not only was it really late, it took them 5 years to put it together for whatever reason, because it was first ordered in 1922 and wasn't delivered till 1927, it was discontinued very quickly, because it never was reliable at any point. It broke all the time, based off of what we know, and the technology was incredibly complicated, as you no doubt have noticed, so yeah, it just didn't really work. I'm not even sure what the wheel arrangement would be for this thing. Some people are saying that it would be a 406, which doesn't make any sense at all. But under the white notation, you aren't supposed to include the wheels on the tender, but the tender is a part of the locomotive. It would technically be a tank engine because of how integral it is to the function. So I guess, looking at it, you would say it's a 1064? I can't even believe I had to say that. I don't even know. Okay, I don't. Y109, the thing. Yeah, that's a thing, alright. Isn't that just a boxcar? Or maybe a cattle car? No, No. No, it isn't. It's a locomotive. Yes, really. Y-109 was originally built by the Phoenix Foundry, Ballarat, as one of Victorian Railway's Y-classes, 060 steam locomotives. She serves faithfully in that form for many years, but during the end of her working life, she was sold to an industrial company, Brunswick Plaster Mills, who then employed her hauling gypsum from the Rock Plain to the VR interchange siding at Nowinji. For some reason, they decided in 1956 to convert her entirely from steam to a diesel mechanical locomotive. What? They removed her boiler and mounted a diesel engine and a transmission on the frame. Then they mounted a sort of shed over the whole thing to provide a cabin for the crew. She worked in the technical sense in that form, but that's the reason why she was called the Thing. You converted a steam engine to diesel mechanical? Because reasons? Yo. I mean, imagine this in the context of Thomas the Tank Engine. Hello, 109. How are you doing today? This one's suffering is eternal. 109, are you alright there? I have lived past the point of death. Entered in a world of purgatory, of unending suffering. 109, we have to get to work. You do this every day. Come on now. Kill me. Kill me! Eventually, she was acquired by Steam Rail Victoria and relocated to their depot. Believe it or not, she's actually still in preservation now, because she's so weird. She was returned to the Murray Mallet district for display in Millewa Pioneer Park. She was restored by volunteers, and actually looks pretty nice now, all things considered, given what a ridiculous creation she is. So I guess that's nice. I see now I only exist to be gawked at, to be stared at. The misfit, the freak, the thing. Let my torment end. The Oregon and California A. What? How did it... Wait, this is a... Did they take an engine and just squish it? Because that's what that looks like. So this is a perplexing locomotive that is not necessarily one of a kind, but very few of these were built. This is a return flue locomotive. Now what the heck does that even mean? Well, in a normal fire tube boiler, the gas and smoke pass through tubes in the boiler and exhaust out the smoke box and smokestack at the front. You probably already knew that when it comes to steam locomotives. But in a return flue, the gas and smoke pass through the boiler to the front and then back again through U-shaped tubes. They go all the way back to the rear of the boiler and go through a smokestack that's actually in the cab. Now why in the blue heck would you ever want to do that? Well, the thing about the smoke exiting in the front of a locomotive is that the smoke has to go back when the locomotive is moving forward, and that can cause it to go in the crew's faces, which is, annoying. A return flue avoids that by having the smoke exit above them, and thus sparing them the smoke in the face thing, but it did create other problems. For one thing, return flues were just more complicated to construct, and having U-shaped tubes took up more space in the boiler, and in a way could be less efficient since the exhaust was cooler coming back. But the biggest issue I find with them is the tremendous discomfort the crew would face in this type of locomotive, which is hilarious because the point was to actually increase their comfort, and yet having the smoke box and the stack in the cab would make things tremendously hot. Like a steam locomotive cab is already notoriously pretty hot because that's what the firebox is, but now so is the smoke box. Everything is back there. The heat in the cab must have been excruciating. This type of design naturally did not take off, as crews were willing to deal with the occasional smoke in the face over a constant risk of heat stroke. This particular model is believed to have been scrapped. The McKean Rail Weed Burners. What? No. No, you're not intentionally starting fire. Oh, no. Union Pacific, no! Well, in 1907, Union Pacific Railway, at their Omaha shops, under the supervision of one Mr. W.R. McKean Jr., who was superintendent of motor power and machinery, put together a gasoline burner and attached it to a rail car. And it can move under its own power, too. As the name would suggest, the railroad was dealing with an overabundance of weeds on their lines, so naturally, the logical conclusion is to incinerate them with the heat of 1,000 suns! And it saw significant use on branch lines. The car is made of steel, and it was mounted on a four-wheel truck. It was actually propelled by gasoline as well. It can move at a top speed of 15 miles an hour, though in practice, in order to actually get the job done, it only moved about 4 or 5 miles an hour. They used compressed air to force the gasoline to the burners that were situated at the rear of the car, near the ground. The railcar's frame itself forced the weeds down, and then the burner, well, burned them. 3 men were required to operate this blasted thing, and yeah, this was a thing that actually existed. And believe it or not, this is not the only example of this madness. It's just the earliest one that I am aware of. Because Australia did this too, utilizing tech from leftover World War II flamethrowers. Yes, really! Now the problem with doing this at all is, well, it involves the use of fire. And, you know, brush fires are a thing. And it just seems to me that perhaps intentionally starting these fires might not be the best call. It's generally a frowned upon practice when it comes to weed control. Like, I get the necessity here, I get why they thought this was a good idea, but not only is it kind of inefficient to do it this way, but the risk of causing a wildfire is very real. And Smokey the Bear does not approve of this particular methodology. Australia seems to still have some of theirs in preservation, as theirs were smaller and unpowered. They were pushed by another locomotive. Union Pacific's earlier edition, though, seems to be lost to time. I found no record of it being preserved in any way. They were likely all scrapped. The Hallcroft-Anderson recompression locomotive. Now, if you don't know the name of this thing, and just look at it, this doesn't look that mad science-y. But upon closer inspection, why does it look like it has side tanks? It's a tender engine. Why would she need side tanks like a tank engine? That doesn't make any sense. Well, that's because that's not what that is. So, this British-built engine is based on a process that was invented by Harry Anderson and John McCallum for the recompression of exhaust steam. Basically, it's another way of reusing already used steam, kind of like a Mallet does, but not at all like how a Mallet would do it. The concept they were working with involved a draft fan, and it was proven to work in a static setting. Richard Munsell, who was the chief mechanical engineer of the Southern Railway, was interested in looking into the idea of creating a locomotive that utilized such technology to possibly improve efficiency. Testing had shown that there would be a 29% fuel saving compared to a traditional locomotive, so it seemed like a good idea. And in fairness, the process they were working with, which is now known as mechanical vapor recompression, is actually very sound. It does function thermodynamically speaking. They converted a pre-existing locomotive for the process, and it was delivered in 1930. The steam raised in the boiler passed through the cylinders and then via grease separators to evaporative coolers on either side of the engine. That's what those weird tanks are. They were partially filled with water from the tender, and the steam that arose from this was piped to the chimney. The steam in the cooler pipes was only partially condensed, but it was way denser, and it was sent to the compressors that were driven by vertical steam engines on each side of the firebox. And then it re-entered the boiler via clack boxes on either side of the steam dome. Those engines also drove gear-type pumps that brought water from the tender for the coolers and the boiler. There was also a valve that allowed for conventional working with a cylinder exhaust going through a blast pipe. That was actually used at starting. It utilized a draft fan that was steam-driven, and it was attached to the inside of the smoke box, and it was critical to this particular thing's function. And already, based on that explanation, I may have lost most of you, and yes, this was an incredibly complicated engine. Most of it actually functioned pretty well. The problem was the stupid fan. The fan was powered by a pretty unusual engine that was patented by Anderson, and it had 4 cylinders that normally worked at 1000 RPM with a 25% cutoff. It's described as a rotary engine. What is known is that it was originally manufactured to work backwards and blow dust and smoke out of the firebox door, and that had to be redesigned, but in any case, the fan failed constantly. And without that, the rest of the engine systems struggled. They were working with it in the mid-30s, around 1934, and she just never did very well, causing so many issues that they lost interest in the project. It probably didn't help that it was the Great Depression, so they couldn't afford to be messing about with something that clearly wasn't working. The engine fortunately wasn't scrapped, at least at first. She was reconverted back to standard form in 1935. But another fun fact, due to the way the engine worked, this was a really quiet steam locomotive. Witness statements say that when she was running, she made no more noise than a typical electric locomotive at the time, which if you've ever been near those when they're idling, generally only emit a low hum. So she was definitely a perplexing beast. But yeah, she just didn't work. The Saxon Class 15, HTV. What is that? What is that? What is the Why would you... What? Wait. No. I want to thank my Discord server for sharing this particular locomotive, because when I saw it, I about had a conniption. What is the deal? Is it sharing the cylinder setup with both sides of the drive system? And, well, let me explain. The Class 15s were a class of goods steam locomotives that were operated by the Royal Saxon State Railways. Both these locomotives were built in 1916 at the Saxon Maschinenfabrik. Yes? Yes? No? I don't know. Anyway, this design was unique in Germany. It involved 2 fixed 6-coupled drives. The outside axles were actually designed as Klein-Linder axles, which had the ability to slide transversely. Basically, they were working on a strong steam engine that could corner really well. And what about the cylinder? Well, it was a double cylinder on each side, each with a high pressure cylinder for the rear and a low pressure cylinder for the front drive. Now, as strange as the whole thing seems, it did work. 2 of these locomotives were built and they did function, able to do exactly what the railway asked of them. Why were there only 2 though? Well, that's because they were flawed at only one way, and that was down to maintenance. They were expensive, due to their drive systems as well as those Klein-Linder axles, which required a special touch to keep them working. But they were considered successful in practice. They rode apparently extremely well, and when the Royal Saxon State Railways was taken over by the Deutsche Reichsbahn, the locomotives were renumbered to 79.001 and 79.002, but they were retired by 1932, and sadly, both were scrapped. The Belgian Type number 3. Well, that doesn't look super weird, just looks like a typical tank engine, and wait, what's that? Why is there a tiny wheel there? No, seriously, why is there a tiny wheel there? Someone tell me why there's a tiny wheel there! In this locomotive that clearly throws the white notation completely out the window, there are technically 6 driving wheels. Also, there are 2 tiny, unpowered wheels in between 2 of the driving axles. What? Belgium! Belgium? What did you do this time? Why would they do this? Well, to be fair, it was for a very practical reason, and it's almost a last-minute fix for a really annoying problem. 10 of these locomotives were built in 1874, and they were supposed to be used on the Luxembourg line. Fine. But the axle load for that line was limited to 14 tons, and as built, these locomotives would have surpassed that by a little bit. It was a problem. So to fix it, they added an extra carrying wheel with lateral play that was also interlinked with the spring balancing on the main wheels. It was literally only there to relieve just a little bit of the axle load so the locomotives could run on those lines. That's it. Barely a mad science experiment, and more of a, oh goodness, we messed up, quick throw a wheel there. But hey, it worked, so you can't really knock it, as bizarre as it was. The reason you don't see this very often is that Well, frankly, it's just completely unnecessary in most cases. Most locomotive manufacturers wouldn't find themselves in this kind of situation. But again, it did work, and they served for several years, though they were, again, all scrapped. The Armstrong-Whitworth Turbine Electric Locomotive. There we go. Yep, just take it in. The longer you stare, the crazier it gets. I swear that looks like a rocket in the back. Like, it's not, but that's what it looks like. What is this? Why? Well, the steam turbine electric locomotive, yes, all of those things, was designed by Mr. D.R. Ramsay, who was the managing director of the Ramsay Condensing Locomotive Company of Glasgow. The thing was built by Armstrong-Whitworth of Newcastle on Tyne, and it was delivered to the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway all the way back in 1922, so this is a very early steam turbine locomotive. I'm trying to figure out how to properly put it into white notation. I think it would be considered a 2-6, not 8, because one of those wheels isn't actually a wheel, it's the driver, so it would be 2662. Of course, the tender is part of the locomotive. Just let it go. Each set of drivers was driven by a jack shaft with 2 3-phase electric motors that were geared to it. Each motor could produce 275 horsepower. And that did mean, to be fair, that most of the weight was available for adhesion. The front unit, like a normal locomotive, did carry the boiler, but underneath it was a compound turbine, direct coupled to a 3-phase AC generator. The rear unit, like a tender, carried fuel, water, but also the air-cooled rotary evaporative condenser. The condenser was fitted to create a sufficient exhaust vacuum for efficient turbine operation rather than to save water. Now, we talked about steam turbines a lot before, and they usually don't work when it comes to locomotives, and this one, unfortunately, is no exception. Though its problem actually had to do with some basic design flaws. The design actually called for the reversing of the direction of the air, so it would flow forwards through the rotary condenser and then upwards through the exit ducting. But the problem with doing that is it caused a loss of airflow, and the condenser couldn't provide a decent exhaust vacuum for the turbine. The boiler size was also fairly restricted, which probably didn't help. She was tested, though almost immediately there was a major problem in that she was grossly overweight. She was 156 tons, even though she was supposed to be 122 tons, with an axle load of 24 tons. It's not known exactly how that happened, but however it did, it almost meant that they wouldn't even test her at all. But they decided to give her a chance and allowed her to go as far as Bolton, and she began her official test runs on the 5th of April 1922. They didn't go very well. Her performance was poor. She was terrible. The forced draft was ineffective, and she had poor fuel combustion as a result. The condenser vacuum also was just terrible. They did modify her and performed further tests, and she managed 48 miles per hour while pulling a 230-ton train, which was pretty impressive, but stationary dynamometer tests showed poor results at less than 30 miles per hour. Which actually sounds about right, because that's usually something that happens with turbines. When they go fast, they do great. They're very efficient. When they go slow, no. Bad. Later, 59 miles per hour was achieved, pulling 65 tons, but the boiler pressure couldn't actually go above 170 psi. Mind you, she was designed to hit 200, and even at speed she really wasn't that efficient. Coal was being burnt in her at 40 pounds a mile. 40 pounds of coal a mile, which is horrifying. A conventional 10-wheeler of the time, mind you, could pull 400 tons at the same burn rate, and many of the future tests got even worse. Eventually, she was just returned to Armstrong-Whitworth and scrapped. Booster locomotives. What in the mechanical madness is going on here? Okay, I've been wanting to talk about boosters for a while because they always seem so perplexing. They look, well, weird, because they are. And they weren't attempted only once. In fact, the phrase booster locomotives covers a wider range of different machinery that use the same principle, which is an extra set of very small wheels and cylinders that provide extra tractive effort at low speeds. Generally, the machinery to do that is actually mounted on the tender of the locomotive, or sometimes attached under the cab. For example, there's the Type AA-1 NR 1400 that operated for the Royal Bavarian State Railways, who to begin with only had one pair of main driving wheels, which was not a good call for 1896, but they had the tiny boosters between the conventional front bogie and the main drivers. They actually weren't always touching the rail. They were held 1¼ inches above it by springs. But when they needed more tractive effort, and given they had one set of driving wheels, they almost always did, the booster was pressed down on the rails by a steam cylinder. The booster axle was powered by 2 small cylinders under the main ones, and it seems to actually have worked in the technical sense, though the design was not repeated. The Royal Bavarians weren't done with this, by the way. They also used the P3.2, which was a much larger locomotive, yet still with a tiny little booster unit in between 2 of the leading wheels this time. Don't ask me what the white notation would be. I don't really want to think about it, okay? Do you even count the booster in a white notation on this sort of thing? Because they're not on the rails all the time. In this locomotive's case, it's believed that these ones were only used for starting. And again, it did technically work. We actually used booster units in America, but ours were much stealthier. They weren't as obvious as the European designs tended to be. They had 4-wheel versions that actually fit on tenders, and 2-wheel units that fit under the cabs of the locomotives. They were a bit more mechanically complex, but they actually were really successful, and many different designs utilized them, on occasion if need be. Even Sir Nigel Gresley over in the UK dabbled into them in the 1920s. He ordered a 2-wheel booster from the Franklin Supply Company, the same company that was building them in America. In this form, they did work. Again, they generally always did, but the problem was down to, did we need to do this? And into the 1930s, that was kind of what was happening. It started becoming clear that modern locomotives didn't need a booster. Locomotives were getting larger, more powerful, more capable, and adding a booster added basically nothing to them at a certain point. Even in America, locomotives were ridiculously strong by the early 1940s. We had Berkshires, Northerns, simple articulates, types of locomotives that already had a ridiculous amount of power. They didn't necessarily need a tiny little booster on top of that, and the same could be said for the UK. There just wasn't a need for the technology. Not that it didn't work, just that it didn't do enough for it to matter that much. So adding the expense in of building and maintaining these boosters when they weren't really needed, I mean, you could kind of see why they stopped being utilized.